Today's reading is about Henry Kissinger and Tom Lehrer. Henry Kissinger played a prominent role in United States foreign policy between 1969 and 1977. During this period, he pioneered the policy of détente with the Soviet Union, orchestrated the opening of relations with China, and negotiated the Paris Peace Accords, which ended American involvement in the Vietnam War. Kissinger has also been associated with U.S. involvement in the 1973 Chilean military coup that overthrew democratically elected President Allende and installed the dictator Pinochet. Kissinger also supported Argentina's military junta for their so-called dirty war. Kissinger is a controversial and polarizing figure in U.S. politics. He is condemned as a war criminal by many journalists, political activists, and human rights lawyers. Christopher Hitchens wrote a book titled The Trial of Henry Kissinger, and this book details a number of the man's war crimes. But by many prominent scholars, Kissinger is venerated as having been a highly effective diplomat. No, Tom Lehrer. Tom Lehrer is a retired American musician, singer-songwriter, satirist, and mathematician. He is best known for the pithy and humorous songs he recorded in the 1950s and 1960s. His songs parodied popular musical forms, and he often created original melodies when doing this. You may remember the Elements, the song, in which Lehrer recites the names of the chemical elements in the periodic table to the tune of something from Gilbert and Sullivan, and of course, the Vatican Rag. In the early 1970s, Lehrer retired from public performance to devote his time to teaching mathematics at the University of California. It was in the year 2001 that Lehrer taught his last mathematics class. Once, when he was asked why he retired from composing satirical songs, he said, "Political satire died on the day that Henry Kissinger was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize." Now, speaking of amazing songwriters, I have in mind also Paul Anka. Today is his birthday. He is 82. In the 1950s, Anka wrote these top songs. You may remember some: Diana, Crazy Love, I'm Just a Lonely Boy, Put Your Head on My Shoulders, and You Are My Destiny, all of those. Later, he composed the song She's a Lady for Tom Jones. He also composed the song My Way for, guess who? Frank Sinatra. On top of all that, Anka composed the theme for Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. Like Tom Lehrer, Paul Anka was an amazing songwriter.
Thank you, Lawrence, for a fun and informative trip down memory lane there. The pandemic was a wake-up call to develop new ways of thinking and addressing the challenges that are confronting us now, as well as those that will emerge in the future. Many of us already wrestle with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity in our lives, and it will only continue. Foresight, or working with the future, is a way of thinking systematically about alternative scenarios of the future. It taps into our ability to anticipate and prepare while providing new tools to engage our imaginations and develop images of a preferred future. Dr. Annette L Gardner, principal of Al Gardner Consulting and formerly an associate professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. She is a political scientist with training in future studies from the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She conducts foresight workshops and professional conferences and works with organizations to evaluate their foresight initiatives. And that's what she is going to do with us this morning. Let's have a rousing ovation from those at the Friendly House and a warm yet muted ovation for Dr. Annette L Gardner.
All right. Well, thank you for that nice introduction. I did write it myself, but I appreciated the enthusiasm you brought to it. I'm delighted to be with you this morning. I wish I could be there in person, Portland is one of my favorite places. I'm a little bit like Bob Dole. I don't know if you remember how he used to go from place to place, and he would always start with this sort of hometown boy sort of thing. My favorite place, and he actually did hearken from a lot of those places. I am not going to do the traditional presentation. As an educator, we're all being retooled to do more with engagement, and that's what I'm going to do with you. And a special call out to Helen, a thank you to her for inviting me. And it was just luck, she would just happen to be with one of my longtime friends, Jane, who I see out in Zoom land. And it was a nice evening taking a walk. And all of a sudden she said, "Do you want to talk?" And I said, "Sure." So here I am. And why don't we get going? We're going to both think about and possibly co-create the future today. We have a good case, or the future of Portland, something we can all get behind. I just wanted to say a little bit more about myself. Everything's true that was said, but I just thought I'd disclose a few more tidbits. I did grow up in Ashland, Oregon, circa the 1970s, and so I've experienced a lot of Oregon since then, up to, well, just yesterday, where I was in Ashland for my 45th high school reunion. I also did go to Reed College. And I kind of expect there's some Reedies out among you. Don't be shy if you want to fess up. And then I did recently retire. This is my new gig, which is all kind of a service orientation. And one of the things I want to mention about UCSF is that what turned out to be really important and continues to be important is the work I do around how do we evaluate advocacy and policy change work? How do we know that truth actually speaks to power? How do we understand Henry Kissinger and deconstruct that and know how to influence, to mitigate or oppose a position that we find unpopular? And certainly being ironic and writing political songs is one particularly good tactic. But more recently, what I do is I try to parlay that research and experience into how do advocates be more in the driver's seat when it comes to both evaluating and using that information to benefit their advocacy. And then the other thing I do, as I say, is I'm still a practicing futurist, and on the left is the picture of me doing a Foresight workshop at Burning Man for a couple of years. That was great fun. I made that hat. It's a very creative activity. And more recently, I've tried to again do some leveraging of my skill set, and I work in the Futures and Foresight community in trying to bring evaluation practice to Foresight. So similar thing, make information about practice and impacts something that can be adopted, leveraged, and do some field building to continue to build out the foundation of future studies. So enough about me. Let's get on to what we're going to do today. Kind of what's called a pracademics, a little bit of academic, a little bit of practice. And so I'll do a review of future studies, concepts and methods. And then we're going to try and take that and work it into a discussion about exploring the future of Portland under 4 alternative scenarios. And I believe you received the handout in one fashion or another. And we'll talk about the implications and see what that leads to in the way of action steps. And in short, we're going to learn and use a different way of thinking, and I'll explain what that is. So let's get on with the why this is worth our bandwidth, given that we have so many other concerns weighing us down. I don't think many of us, except perhaps World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, when we have felt that the world is really, pressing on us to do something. And one of the things about thinking about the future is that it can inform the decisions you make in the present. So much of the way we think about planning and strategic planning as a way of setting our milestones 5 years into the future with a particular goal, so can thinking about the future impose a certain amount of process as well as an endpoint that we can work toward, just set further out than a strategic planning framework. Here's the thing about power, not everybody has it. It's not equally distributed. And something, the same thing is that a lot of powerful interests have a future in mind and are gunning for it. So if you don't think about the future, these other powers, hegemonic or local, they will do it for you and they won't necessarily include you. So you better get into the game and do it yourself. Actually, I think both George Burns and Woody Allen said a very similar thing about, of course, he should be invested in thinking about the future because that's where we're going to be. And it seems like much like building a house, you really care about the interior and the exterior, and you are involved, and so should we. And then last, which is something that all of us who are parents or grandparents or who work with youth, is the realization that, we owe it to them to create a future where they can live, and this is the scary part about climate change, is that we are quickly seeing a future emerge where future generations not only have to worry about housing availability and affordability, but how is climate going to hem in where they get to be in the world? So I don't think we would disagree with any of these things. I think that the issue is that, how do we move to the next step? And that's always the big struggle, is that, we have competing priorities. So this one has to move up the list of priorities. Oops. Anyway, I just want to add that perhaps that is a traditional list that the future studies community. I think I can hear somebody needs to mute. So I think the other thing that we are feeling more so than in let's say 20 years ago, is a sense of urgency. Like, not only are things volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, or VUCA, but we are starting to see some significant and fast-moving change around climate, the warming Atlantic Ocean and the flow of the currents, the heat wave that a lot of the world has experienced this summer. The fires from 2020 were on such a scale that none of us, I think, and I lived through the fires in Oregon in the 1970s, and that was arson. So everything is scaled up in its enormity, and I think we're starting to realize it's not just localized anymore. So let's just take a couple minutes to kind of get into the first step of thinking about the future. And I definitely have to move all of our pictures out of my way. We always have to recognize that the past and the present and the future are linked. And we can many times see the antecedents in the past. We've taken Kissinger, we can go forward and see how all of his actions in a way spun out. And so what we want to talk about, just to get us, and we're not going to give enough time to this activity, is just, and again, this can be by individuals or pairs. Let's just take a maybe 5 minutes. It might be quicker than that. Is just reflect and talk about it with your neighbor about, how has Portland changed since 1980? And for those of you who are new to the state, something to think about, and why I picked 1980, is that we were entering a recession then. And it was gloomy. I mean, it's always kind of gloomy and overcast in Portland, and particularly, but the recession hit really hard. We had families living under the Burnside Bridge in tents. And Powell's was still just a one-site store. The Galleria had not been built in downtown Portland. So Portland, basically the streets rolled up at night by about 10 o'clock. It was Huber's was the high point of the evening, the nightlife for many of us. So for those of you who are remember Portland and back then, and just think in your mind, how has it really changed over, gosh, is it 43 years? I guess that's right. But for those of you who have been 10 years, have probably seen some changes as well. 20 years, definitely. So just take a moment. I'll stop talking so you can just think about this. Excellent. And then the second question is, not everything changes. So maybe comment on what hasn't stayed the same, just so we have some balance in what we're remembering. Hey, so let's a little bit of a discussion. I know it's tough to do it with the group in the room, but basically we just want to get people realizing that we don't live in static times. I was kind of curious to know what had not changed, and I was thinking about that. Even the foliage is more of it. It feels like, and they're what weird. There was no weird in 1981. So all I can think of is change. I was trying to think of anything that has remained the same. So, but the idea is to kind of get us to realize that things are very fluid. Even in what used to be the backwaters of, well, a lot of the United States, Oregon was its own bubble in many ways. It didn't transition off timber for a long time. So let us be a little more concrete now in thinking forward. And I just want to give you some grounding or the historical overview, and just to get the sort of academic part out of the way. But this is a way that we think we've progressed. And a lot of this is the story of human consciousness, and starting back at a time where, we would read the environment, the stars, to get information. And our times did not change very quickly. They were season based, agricultural based. It was a slower time. So we would read the world around us. Increasingly, we moved to a time of prophecy, reading the entrails of animals, reading tea leaves. We kept broadening our scope, our inquiry. And increasingly, we moved to forecasting and trying to project out into the future based on data, what we knew in the past, see if we could roll it into the future. And from a future studies discipline perspective, we have now moved past that to say that's not enough to give us any insights on and assistance around navigating the future. So we now think in terms of preferable, probable, and possible futures. And the scenario discussion will flesh that out. But basically, as I said, pre-1400s, pre-Enlightenment, stars in nature, oracles and prophets. Post 1400s with the Enlightenment, we have science, we have exploration of the stars, we have exploration, we have commerce going around the globe, and we still have visionaries. We always have that mystical side. And I have to say, this does sound like a sort of Western perspective. We tried to bring in sort of East and West, but maybe it is still a little bit Western centric in terms of, like, we think about Europe in the 1800s, where we see clear signs of progress. We know that science fiction and Jules Verne catches hold. And also we start coming up with images of how we want society to be. And with the 1945, particularly when we have a clear information about what we do and we don't want, we see more intentionality, not just building the city and its buildings, but actually planning becomes a real activity, and particularly around with fields like sociology, informing us about demographics and culture. But meanwhile, you have a bit of a meltdown in the 1960s, where we realize that maybe the modern and progress isn't really serving our needs. It's not, plus equality is what we're talking about back then, not even equity. It's not evenly distributed. And we're having a great social upheaval about rights and privileges, and around the civil rights movement. And meanwhile, Foresight flourishes, driven in part by the military interests and establishment of think tanks like the RAND down in Southern California. And kind of where we have progressed to today is now a little bit more of a postmodern balance with modern, and deconstructing and looking at things through a new lens. We've just spoken about with VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We are realizing that aspiration and creativity and imagination are actually the necessary tools for being able to think more broadly and further around what we can anticipate, and then taking that anticipation to actually co-create a preferred future, because democracy in many ways hinges on this in terms of participation and representation. And we have sort of basic images that we can kind of all relate to about, and some of us still read the tea leaves and our believe in astronomy that hasn't gone away. We still believe that we can look out into the future at a distance, that it's out there, but I think that metaphor is failing us. And also now we are realizing that it really is about the people in the future being part of the equation. So that is a very quick historical overview. I'm happy to follow up if anybody wants citations or resources, but let me keep going. Well, when we talk about thinking about the future, we really have a discipline. It is a systematic study of preferred, probable, and possible futures. And we have foresight as the competency or practice. People who do foresight workshops, who work with government or the corporate sector around how to systematically bring certain tools into their organization. We now understand that people are futures literate. It's like a competency, and that they know how to understand the nature of the future and the role it plays, and that they understand that these are factors that we can chart, that we can think about in concrete ways and use to support decision making. And then I have to get this out of my, and that also where the field is realizing it is not enough to be in an ivory tower and just think about these things and write peer review articles, but we actually have to anticipate and use the future. So that is where we're at as a field, is the using of the future. And basic sort of commonly held, not just beliefs, this comes out of the research. There is a research base on future studies, is that some of the things that we kind of take for granted, but we know for a high degree of certainty, is that the future has not happened yet, which even though we think there are powers that be that are controlling our present, that future has not yet happened. It's not yet tomorrow. It's still today. And that gives us some leverage about thinking about it and anticipating it and doing something about it. We know that the future is plural, and there's a grand array of alternative futures. We know that the future is open. We can shape it, though the extent to which we can is always where we get a little bit hung up on. The future is fuzzy just means that there's a lot of it's not very well defined. So again, we should manage our expectations. Future is surprising. We'll see more disruption, even though the pandemic did come out as a big surprise, though some people knew it was a great possibility, but still there are other types of changes that will be disruptive. They'll be volatile. The future isn't always surprising. Some things, like we've known that we were going to be an aging population way back in the 80s. We knew that even before then, we knew that post World War II, we would have this baby boom generation and they were going to all get old. So no surprises there. Sometimes the future is fast, like technology and the adoption of the smartphone, but sometimes it's slow, like demographics. So these are kind of useful concepts to remind ourselves periodically that, that again, we have a bit more power when we understand the nature of the future. And we have other attributes, not just power, but as humans, and most of us are, I'm assuming, well educated, we have attributes that are helpful for thinking about the future. We learn from the past. We are actively involved in monitoring and noticing the environment. We can recognize change. We think in relations. We tend to be creative and borrow from other disciplines. We are curious. That's why we are here today. We're open and flexible, maybe not always, but and then many of us balance our subjective thinking with our objective thinking. I assume that's part of the humanist ideals. And then we are hopefully constantly refreshing our ideas and sources and not in a silo about our thinking. So just tapping into what we already know about ourselves, because what we're going to do is try and parlay that into different types of methods. That this is where the systematic piece comes in, is that we know we can do scanning, very organized scanning. Sometimes it's called horizon scanning. It's a method that you can bring into a public sector or private sector organization, set it up, and know to look at a variety of sources to capture what are calling hits or emerging issues and trends. We know we can do forecasts, like forecasting the baby boomer generation in terms of demographic forecasting. We can do alternative scenarios as a process, and that's what we'll do today. We've been doing computer modeling since forever in terms of being able to identify two variables, cross-impact them, and see how they spin out going forward. Delphi is a way of surveying experts on the likelihood of particular activities or events. And then visioning is something that caught hold in the 1990s to be able to say to groups and organizations, what do you want your future to look like? And then think big about that and come up with something that will move your community or organization toward that future. So let's talk about the future of Portland and get into the more engaging aspect of this talk. And future's plural. We're not going to think about sort of the future that we think is most likely to happen. That can be its own kind of trap. And this is where we get a little bit into understanding, well, what's going to shape that future. And of all the takeaways of tools that has, I think, sort of the greatest traction and easiest to do, and you can do it as part of your newspaper or news coverage. How many of us read the newspapers? I do. But understanding what the forces for or trends are and how are they shaping the future. So these trends are not only shaping the future of Portland, but many of the others, particularly in the US, communities. So technology is a big one. And it could be ChatGPT, taking artificial intelligence to the next level. Automation is huge. And both in a factory setting, but also now, if we're talking ChatGPT, automation is on the table about creative endeavors like writing and thinking. Economic fragility and uncertainty. The pandemic was a really interesting time for having to think, how will our economy, 2 to 3 years after the pandemic look like? And it provoked quite a bit of inquiry that pre-pandemic, we would not have been thinking those terms about our economy. We also know that economies are very local, and each of them have been tumultuous in their own ways. San Francisco's economy is talking about a doom spiral. Who would have thunk it? It's San Francisco. Threats to democracy and the rise of autocracy weighs heavily on a lot of us right now, because we didn't think the US would creep up so close to that. And we saw ourselves doing that. And we're worried that this is going to be the perennial issue of our country's politics. Climate change, real and present danger. It's not just an existential threat. I think as people have to understand, it is a real threat. Growing gap between the haves and have-nots, as all of our communities wrestle with the fact that homelessness is not getting better for many people. and our solutions to it are not solutions, they're band-aids. And also, just to state the obvious, most of us are not getting any younger, and that will persist. And it makes a big difference to how we allocate our resources. So those are the things to think about going forward, what's going to make a difference in our lives and in our planning and our politics. So let's talk about scenarios as a way to take those trends. It's a really nice way of packaging them and translating them into stories. And that's how you create a scenario. You identify all your trends, you cross impact them, you forecast them out, and then you create the narrative that comes out of that. And we're going to work with a particular kind of, there's actually 27 scenario approaches, and we are using a very traditional one, which is taking some archetypes, and they tend to be plausible images of the future. They're set far enough out so that they are surprising and novel. They're not, things will happen, there will be change, and the future will be different, but not totally different from the present. They tend to be broad and deep, and they use trends, wildcards, and uncertainties. They are unlikely, the future then is unlikely to be any one particular scenario, but these scenarios themselves create like a simulation. They create something where you can look and say, well, how are we going to react? How is decision making need to change so that our communities are in a state of preparedness? So we're going to go through the 4 scenarios that we're going to talk. I have to move you all down on my screen. Okay, and I'm realizing we're getting to the 30-minute transit, the point where we're going to transition to the breakouts. So I'm going to talk very quickly about the scenarios that you are then going to read in a narrative form in your breakout groups. So just to kind of get your thinking moving, because the biggest challenge to this exercise is to delink from the past enough and you let your imaginations run wild. So the first scenario is business as usual. Like its name implies, it's an extension of our present, but everything has only amplified or ramped up. So, and this one assumes a positive economy. We rebound after the pandemic, and again, things take off like they were before around the technology sector, energy, calling the shots around the economy, and it just only goes further in that direction. The growing divide between the haves and have-nots only is exacerbated, and the problem only grows larger. We don't solve it. We tend to continue to react to climate change versus anticipating and being proactive. And then the thing about this is that it builds on this trend about the rise in autocracies, but also the erosion of the state around public support and welfare systems or a safety net. So it's a weak state. In terms of, it does have some guardrails, it does still have a safety net, but it's easy to fall through the cracks. But there is definitely a state presence, and many times it's just in partnership with the private sector, and we just keep privatizing. So that's business as usual. It would be called a probable scenario. It's not only possible, but it is high degree of likelihood. Second one is a very technology-based scenario. And again, this is what it looks like if it's spun out and it's like technology really drives the scenario. So AI drives the economy, it's making decisions, advances in genetics and life extension and robotics only moves us further into that sort of cyborg scenario. I think we have colonies on the moon and Mars, and the growing divide between haves and have-not, it's similarly bad under this scenario. But the state really gets to get some benefit out of this, and the state is the all-seeing eye. For those of you who have read, of course, seen Lord of the Rings and read Tolkien, and you see this a lot in all the science fiction shows and movies today. So we all have a pretty good sense of what it means when technology runs amok. This is where things really fall apart globally. And, we see this in our communities, but it's still very much, even though some of it seems very much in our face, this is still, this is at the margins of our society. This is where society as a whole just falls apart due to climate change, due to a failure of the economy and of the state. That doesn't mean the rich don't still get richer and have protections and have their gated communities and access to life extending technology. They do. And then the state it's no longer a real player. It's kind of at every community and every individual for him or herself. So this is pretty much, the worst case scenario. And last is, and not to get all looking through rose-colored glasses on you, this is the where we get our act together around climate change. The state has to do it, so we have a strong state. It's very much more values-based, but not quite everybody has a kumbaya moment as much as these are important culturally. Community is important, and we have a much more heal the earth perspective. But as you'll read in the narrative, it comes at a cost, and you have to, this is where people have to start talking about the rights of the individual versus the rights of the collective. So those are our 4 scenarios. We're going to break out in groups. I'm not sure we're actually going to have all 15 minutes, but let's get going and see how it goes. I can check in with the online groups. So the instructions are really easy. If they don't stay on the screen, no biggie. You read the scenario, just read it to yourself. You want to kind of put on a Foresight hat, which means you're not going to question it to death. You're not gonna say, never gonna happen. Instead, you're just going to step into it. It's like going to a movie. You just go to get into the spirit of it, feel what it's like, and then answer some questions and discuss them with the group. What's Portland going to look like under this scenario? And it could be basic things like, what are your grandchildren doing in case you're not around in 2040? And maybe you moved out of Portland. And then what are those characteristics of Portland under that scenario? And if you want to pick on particular places in the city or activities or the cultural, do that, but just try to, answer these questions with as much sort of like description, so that you kind of get into using the scenario to guide your imagination and thinking. So with that, let's break out. We'll have about 15 minutes, and I'll check in to see if that's too long and we can end it a little sooner. So go, and like I said, let your imaginations run wild. Okay, well, let's get going. The questions, if anybody wants to be brave and step up to the mic or say it through Zoom or in the chat, about what might your grandchildren be doing? What are the characteristics? Tell us a little bit about what you came up with, either individually or as your group.
So Hank Robb is speaking for group number 4. We were talking about sustainability. And one of the points, we didn't really talk about what the exact impact on our lives would be, but an economy of growth would be what we would have given up. And so rather than a growth economy, with the notion that we so often hear, a rising tide lifts all boats, the tide's not going to rise. So the issue of who's got a boat is probably going to become more prevalent, and what size would the boat be? In terms of more sort of practical day-to-day things, the life of grandparents is going to be impacted, we imagined, because there just can't be so many people. Either that's a state intervention or I heard somebody recently say there's two kinds of leadership. One in which you make people do things, and the other in which you make people want to do things. So I don't know if people will want to reduce their family sizes. It certainly has been the case since the Protestant Revolution, that certain people chose to have much smaller numbers of children, but we'll see about that. But that whole, I move where my children are because that's where the grandchildren are. That's going to be a different life because it's just not going to be the grandchildren. And the second thing is for reasons of energy, we'd be tolerating much greater temperature extremes. My example was I recently was someplace that was very warm, and just to live life, you had to sort of constantly accommodate yourself to being sweating, because that was just how it was. You could go from one air-conditioned place to another, but you even when you got to the air-conditioned place, you were wet. And there was a place that somebody had an Airbnb there, and there was air conditioning, but only in the sleeping quarters. The rest of the building was not air conditioned. So those are some examples of what life might be like then.
Okay. I think we have time for one more person from a maybe different scenario who wants to chime in, and we'll try to do really just a quick reaction, and or similarly, how have things shifted for Portland? Lewis?
Caroline came and joined me in scenario number 3, and I hadn't even read the header, and it's just scared her off. She had to go, and I kept her there by saying, well, let's find something a little nicer. And so we went down and did scenario number 4, and she liked that a lot better and stayed with me, but I think I still rallied her, and so she had to leave. And I guess that's probably just kind of germane of the issue here is to get people activated and informed and motivated to accept what we have to do to move forward is the only thing I can get out of that situation. We didn't even go through the logistical steps of the scenario because you couldn't do it. And I get that. We have to preserve ourselves.
Well, let's transition from there to point 2, which is how do you mobilize people to get involved around that conversation? That the future is scary, but that doesn't let us off the hook for doing something about it. We have, and I think that we probably all here feel a sense of responsibility. So, and the way you make things less scary is to make them more concrete and bring it back to the present. And you ask some questions that we can answer, which is the community prepared for any and all of these scenarios? And, Portland has to wrestle with, is it ready for anything that happens along, with the Cascadia subjunction? And you're right on the, at the fault line there. And I know there's been a lot of sort of emergency plan, FEMA type of planning around what will happen to the buildings, to the population. So you have experience with the scary future already. But yeah, how do you lay that groundwork to think about it and then ask the question as broadly as you can under a worst case and a best case and a preferred case? And talk about the role of citizens in shaping this future. So you are again adding that element of empowerment and engagement. And then you have to ask, well, what about the other stakeholders? We are all in this together, right? So as decision makers, corporate leadership, unions, are we all of us in this together to think systematically about the future and take that learning and do something about it? So that's what we mean about like the implications, but play that out into concrete steps, because I think when you take the problem and you open it up, that's when you get people into the place where they think they can actually and want to do something. So other things that we can do, many times we call this the act of future proofing, and taking strategic plans, for example, and stress testing them, taking recommendations and saying, well, how are they going to fare under these 4 scenarios? Even if we think scenario 2 or 3 won't happen, what if it did? Well, let's think that through. We can actually link foresight, which is way past the 5-year time horizon of planning, and make sure that because that's a whole set of ideas and information that will inform planning in a different way than what we do when we do a basic SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities, threats approach to planning. And then there's this piece about citizen involvement and about co-creating a preferred future. And we all like that 4th scenario, but it's not, as we describe in the narrative, things don't happen the way they used to in terms of certain privileges and freedoms. And the state is much more in the driver's seat. And people who are still, clinging to that rugged individualism, libertarian perspective are going to struggle with that scenario. How do we bring them on board? So anyway, those are the ways that we see foresight being used in what's called public sector foresight. We know that Oregon has its own 2050 project, and it's, again, interestingly, phase 1 is establishing a shared understanding. And when we say shared, a lot of this is based on people's values and assumptions. And if you can start there, instead of throwing a lot of predictions, or by the way, we don't predict, we do projecting and forecasting and all that. But since change is happening so fast, prediction is kind of off the table. Oops, that's my timer. And then the community engagement piece, and then moving to policy and decision making. So that is, I couldn't find anything specific for Portland, by the way. So if any of you need another good project, wait, isn't one of you retired and needing something to do? So anyway, that is really it for me. I've got resources and handbooks and guides and tools. There are associations. This is influencing at the global level. It used to be much more pronounced at the federal level when we had an Office of Technology Assessment. Even Newt Gingrich was on the side of the foresight profession long time ago. So I'm happy to, if we've got any questions in chat, or I'm going to leave my slides, or people want to follow up, there's my contact information. So that is what I have for you today. I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gardner, for an excellent presentation. You got us involved. It was very thought-provoking. We do have about 10 minutes for questions. I'll go ahead and ask the first question as we wait for things in the chat. As I think about the 4 different scenarios for Portland, and I think about the future, it seems to me that it might be a combination of those 4. If you think about Portland, it's very neighborhood centered, and it's also sort of theme centered. I could see a part of Portland that really embraces technology and goes off on the technical standpoint. Then there would be another neighborhood of Portland that is more sustainability. There's obviously poverty, and there's going to be that going forward. And then some people try and hang on to the status quo. So when scenarios are proposed, it doesn't the future kind of involve all of those scenarios, depending on the scope of society and how you look at it.
And I might not have said it enough, is that that's true. The future will be a combination of the scenarios. It's just what way will they tilt? And that's why we do the sort of 4 categories, sometimes 5. And it's I guess in my mind, it's what do we as a society want? And then in under these, some of these scenarios, society is not even at the table. So it comes back to, power and politics and policy. So yes. And are we going in any, but I would say, the Chat GPT discussion right now, we see society very much at the technology table. We have had guardrails, so that technology scenario may not dominate. But we put it out there so people, don't question it too hard.
We have a question from Al at the Friendly House. He's known for his challenging questions.
Okay, I got a challenging question. I used to be a project consultant, and I had relatively large businesses I was consulting with. And I told them, don't schedule any projects longer than 18 months because you'll never finish them. Why are we planning till 2040? Why aren't we doing something we can do in 18 months or less? In 2 years, we'll have an election cycle. Anything that we started more than 2 years ago, people will be bored with, and they'll vote out the money, and the money will get cut off, and you'll have nothing. So it's like the war on poverty died after a couple of years. Big projects don't go anywhere.
Okay, let her
One
answer.
step at a time.
So this is a perennial question for discussion and debate about balancing long-termism and short-termism. And that the problem, and that structurally short-termism is what dominates a lot of our policy making. 4-year time limits, the pressures to fundraise, but also some of this, and just like I said, competing priorities. The now is in front of us. It inhales a lot of our bandwidth. But we also know, and Shell Oil did a scenario planning. It's all very well documented. I think this is like 1980s, 1990s, and they did a scenario approach. They changed the trajectory of their company, and they did very well by that. And it wasn't just a leap of faith. This is all very, data rich when you get into the forecasting piece in particular. So, the question is, how do you see that the long view, long-termism is the opportunity to really alter your trajectory and not let yourself be so bound to the short term. But you're right, change is happening so quickly, but then that's where you have to be flexible, resilient, and nimble, and you can build that into your organization. You can do mid-course corrections. Probably we've been doing that for decades. It maybe just wasn't so noticeable, but we build that into planning and operations and project management. So we just have to be increasingly nimble and sometimes more creative. And this is where AI, Chat GPT, could hold great promise because it can do some of that fast thinking for us. So
Yes, let me follow up about that, because you just mentioned a corporate organization. Now, corporations are not democracies. To me, the real question, if you're going to have long-term planning, is that compatible with a democracy? China clearly has long-term planning.
yeah.
They have long-term execution, but they can have it because they are not cycling every 4 years. They're not cycling every 2 years. Do we have any evidence that the kind of power, the kind of consistency over time that we need is compatible with democracy?
Well, this is where, okay, so one thing about is there used to be all the rage, something called visionary leadership. And again, Xi Jinping may be a very visionary leader, and he just happens to be in the enviable position of not having any opposition.
No, he didn't happen to get in that position. He eliminated the opposition.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, a lot of this is culture bound and context driven. But my point is that we were for a long time through the business community training leaders to be visionary, that they needed some point out into the future that we knew it couldn't be a fixed point. And we said, look, have a 5-year image, 10 even better, and be be the person who is going to bring your company and train up your next level of leadership so that you could have a visionary team. And we understood this. This was all written up in, you know, the MIT School of Business and that business journal, that we needed leadership that wouldn't bog down on day-to-day operations. That's not why we hired them. Now, you know, but in terms of the consistency piece, you know, I think that's a luxury we don't have anymore. And so we have to kind of get with the program in our particular context, this messy democracy, where we've seen some inroads around localism and you know, groups and communities that have taken real responsibility. I mean, we've been struggling with apathy in the US and low voter turnout, and we have a really activated youth right now. Youth voter turnout is starting to exceed that of other age groups. So we are seeing some positive changes, taking a long time. You know, and this is our reality. And China is you know, they have a different set of factors, but that we have to kind of keep some image out there. I want to recommend Kim Stanley's book, Ministry of the Future, kind of part science fiction, but part, what's cool about it is it goes out 40 years and it gets you, oh, I don't want to give you a spoiler on this, but it starts in a very dark place about climate change. But what's great about it is it gets you to answer that question about what do you do when you don't have consistency, but you do have a certain amount of power, politics, and a global arena in which to do decision making. And it talks about the dynamics that are at play, and some short-term, some long-term. And it's the savvy and experienced person who's really able to navigate in that situation. I suggest it highly. It will resonate. Everything about it is very current, and then how it moves forward into the future is all about strategy and decision making. And but none of it's smooth sailing. That's the other thing. This is not going to be smooth sailing. It hasn't been. And it's increasingly a crowded, congested political arena, lots of voices, and we have to work that out.
The author of that book was Kim Stanley, and then the title one more time?
Ministry of the Future.
Ministry of the Future. Sounds good. Let's go back to the friendly house for a question from Joyce.
I believe you started to answer my question. I was thinking about the messiness of democracy and the fact that figuring out what we as a society want seems to me almost impossible right now. And I feel that part of that is the internet. Now that we have this ability for everyone to put their opinions out there, they're so diametrically opposed in so many cases that is that where we need to start working to sort of, and maybe there is hope in the youth. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Maybe you started to answer my question, but it seems a huge task to find out what a society wants. One thing, no.
You know, I think if we look across the values of our society, we care about youth, we care about family, we have some sense that that there are still things we can have some agreement about. And Robert Reich, did some in 2016, right after the elections, he went around and he went to these communities to ask, well, what do we all agree on? Because obviously politics is, and it's not to say we don't have schisms every which way where we disagree, but he started to find the commonalities, and a lot of this is still about safe communities, reasonable, good roads, clean water, a healthy place to raise our children, and we still want the best for our children. So if you can find all those places, and sometimes it's about starting from there versus the places where we are in opposition or disagreement. And then you talk, well, how do we get that? And now that we have people with a shared purpose, like a better future for our children, but now we want that to be for all children and equity, then you start, pulling in the people who, yes, they do have a vested interest in their children. So maybe they don't agree on how to go about it, but they're at the table, because that's what we're wrestling with, right? The politics of outrage and the internet and all the social media is about divide and conquer. And once we name that, which is what we're doing, we have research, saying, well, what has been the influence Facebook and these other social media platforms on our thinking and decision making. And if we can get past outrage and divide and conquer, so that we're not provoked by hot button issues like gun rights and reproductive health rights and all that, we will come back to the things that unite us. But it's messy and it's painful, and it's troubling that we're in this state of upheaval about these things. But maybe out of that is where we'll see some real change, instead of staying consistent and status quo. That's where we'll have opportunity and creativity.
And Dr. Gardner, I had a question, kind of a follow-up on that theme. You're obviously talking to a group of humanists that believe that humankind is responsible for solving our problems, that we're capable of gathering information. I'm curious if futurists have done any studies on how their work lands with the humanists, the non-believing, non-supernatural community versus religious communities. Is there any difference when futurists present to a religious community, say, how their information is received versus a group like ours?
That's a great question. I don't know, because we do speak to anybody, but I know that we have, as among our futurists, people who very much, bring faith to the table. And, and again, it's kind of that bridge between art and science, and the physical and the metaphysical. And I think, as futurists, we understand and respect the role of religion and, of ethics. Ethics plays a big part. So I think we just have to show up, be respectful, and understand that is what shaping people may make a difference to people's perspectives. And that fourth scenario, religion has a place in there, and other types of forms of spirituality. So yeah, I don't know that we distinguish, truthfully. I think we try to be good about targeting our message a little so it resonates. So we pay attention to who we are speaking to. I am going to go back to Dubai in November, and it isn't a democracy. Only 10% of that population can vote. What are called the Emirate. Everybody, in particular, the women are clothed, with face masks. The women. And I do struggle with that in terms of gender rights and equity, and 90% of the population is there at the whim of the government and can be deported at any time. So they're very much more interested in hearing about modern technology-based scenarios as they transition from oil and gas to a more tech-based economy. And you just have, I just cover up my bare arms. I have to be very careful about cursing on the elevator, which I did at one point, which is actually, a punishable offense. You have to kind of be like an anthropologist and be respectful and understand, what is appropriate.
Sounds good. I think that's a great place to leave it today. Dr. Gardner, thank you so much for your presentation and the way that you engaged this morning. We